The German Supreme Command should really have been aware from the start that Army Group A could not stay in the Caucasus if the battle to free 6th Army did not immediately succeed. In other words, if there were no clear possibility of somehow establishing a reasonably secure situation within the large bend of the Don. But when the enemy tore a gap on the right wing of Army Group B, which opened his way to Rostov, it should have been palpably evident to anyone that there could no longer be any question of holding the Caucasus front. Unless, of course, Hitler had been able or willing to bring in large bodies of troops from other theatres. As early as 20th December, the day when the flight of 2 Italian divisions had exposed the flank of Army Detachment Hollet and cleared the Russians' way to the Donetsk crossings, I had pointed out to General Zeitzler that by advancing in the direction of Rostov, the enemy would now have his chance to strike the decisive blow against the whole of the German southern wing. On 24th December, I had again drawn attention to the fact that it was now no longer the fate of Don Army Group alone that was at stake, but of Army Group A as well. I have already mentioned the rejection of my demand for the release of forces from Army Group A to Rostov and 4th Panzer Army. Even if one no longer envisaged renewing the attempt to extend a rescuing hand to 6th Army, it was still in Army Group A's interest that 4th Panzer Army should be reinforced, since its defeat would have given the enemy access to the Army Group's rear. Since Army Group A, quite understandably, did not want to hand any units over, it was the business of the Supreme Command to order the equalization of forces so urgently needed between the two army groups. One possible reason for Army Group A's refusal to let us have the divisions we asked for, see the chapter on Stalingrad, may well have been the quite perplexing degree to which its formations and units had been shuffled around and intermingled with one another. Undoubtedly, the disengagement of the larger ones would have been a difficult and at best time-consuming task. This state of affairs was in part the inevitable outcome of a need, in the absence of adequate reserves, to patch up the gaps caused by enemy penetrations. However, it was also due in equal measure to the army groups having for months on end been without a commander of its own to keep things in order. At the best of times, many military commanders are unable to appreciate that units must be left in their normal order of battle if one is to achieve maximum efficiency and preserve maneuverability. When, as in this case, there was no responsible commander whatever for a considerable period, it was hardly surprising if the troops became disorganized. In response to the insistence of Don Army Group, Hitler finally decided on 29th December to order the withdrawal of the eastern and most exposed wing of Army Group A, 1st Panzer Army, to the Kuma sector of Piatigorsk-Praskovaya, yet he still had no intention of giving up the Caucasus front as a whole. Evidently, he still hoped that by bending back Army Group A's eastern wing to the Kuma, he would be able to pivot it upon the Manich flats, thereby stabilizing the situation between the Manich and Don, and simultaneously keeping the communications of the southern wing open across the lower Dnieper. Thus, the balcony, which had been formed in November by pushing the front out into the Caucasus and up to the Volga, and which had led to the unfavourable situation we were in at present, was not to be eliminated, but merely reduced in size. Where, on the other hand, the forces were to be found to compensate for the loss of the Romanian and Italian armies, and before very long the Hungarian one as well, remained a complete mystery. This, in due course, was what caused the remainder of the Caucasus front to be abandoned. In this second phase of its struggle, Don Army Group was confronted with the following tasks. Instead of acting as the situation really demanded and radically shifting the main point of effort to its western wing to remove the danger of being cut off, the Army Group was compelled, in the face of a mounting crisis, to fight for time. South of the lower Don, it had to protect Army Group A's rear, and at the same time to keep its communications through Rostov open. It was a dual commitment with which the weak forces of 4th Panzer Army were unlikely to cope in view of the wide expanse of territory they had to control between the Caucasus and Don and the strength of the enemy operating there. In the large bend of the Don and forwards of the Donets, it was the job of Army Detachment Hollet to retard the enemy's advance north of the lower Don, to such an extent that he could not cut off 4th Panzer Army, and with it Army Group A, by a swift thrust on Rostov from the east. In addition, it had to prevent the enemy from crossing the Donets line Forstadt-Kamensk-Voroshilovgrad, and thereby deny him access to Rostov from the north. Finally, the army group had to find ways and means of keeping open the lines of communication running to the lower Dnieper in the west, either with its own resources or else with the assistance of what meagre reserves OKH was able to send us. All this had to be done with troops who had long been subjected to overstrain and were faced by an enemy many times stronger than themselves. Difficult though this task, or series of tasks, was in itself, the paramount danger lay in Army Group A's inability to disengage swiftly from the Caucasus. It was just one more example of the hardening up process which inevitably sets in whenever mobile operations degenerate into static warfare. If only for the sake of economizing one's forces, immovable weapons have to be dug in and rations and ammunition accumulated. Various facilities are installed to ease the lot of the troops, a particularly important measure when a shortage of reserves prevents them from being taken out to rest. As the horses cannot usually be fed in a static battle zone, they have to be accommodated further back, and this in turn tends to immobilize the fighting units. The state of the roads during a Russian winter, particularly in mountainous country, only added to these difficulties. The upshot is always that troops and formation staffs lose the knack of quickly adapting themselves to the changes of situation which daily occur in a war of movement. Inertia and stagnation gain the upper hand, for every change involves difficult reliefs, movement of forces, inconveniences, and often danger. The inevitable process of accumulating weapons, equipment, and stores of all kinds ties down assets which one feels unable to do without for the rest of the war. The result is that when the command staff in question is faced with the necessity of a major withdrawal, it begins by asking for a long period of grace in which to prepare for the evacuation. It may even reject the idea of a withdrawal out of hand because of the equipment and stores it has come to regard as indispensable. It will be remembered that when the German offensive came to a standstill in 1918, even such a notable commander as Ludendorff could not bring himself, by a boldly conceived withdrawal, to precipitate the war of movement in which Germany's last hope of victory then lay. In the final analysis, he felt unable to write off all the material committed on and behind the German front, or else could not make up his mind to abandon territory which it had cost such sacrifices to win. The situation on Army Group A's front was a similar one. A talk with the Chief of Staff of 1st Panzer Army revealed that this formation could not begin moving back until 2nd January, but after we had helped out with petrol it was finally able to start on New Year's Day. Even then, Army Group A announced a few days later that 1st Panzer Army would have to fall back onto the Kuma Line sector by sector in the interest of getting equipment out and evacuating the wounded from the mountain resorts in the Caucasus. For these purposes, it was stated, the Army would require 155 trains, 20 per division, and would not, on account of the low rail capacities, be in a position along the Kuma line for another 25 days. So although it should have been realised since the end of November that at least the rear of Army Group A would be endangered sooner or later, it was obvious that nothing had been done to prepare for an evacuation. One reason for the omission was undoubtedly that Hitler had forbidden such preparations, or was expected to do so if he learned of them. But an equally important one, I am sure, was the Army Group's lack of a responsible commander in recent months. OKH had been considering the idea of placing Army Group A, which had now been taken over by Colonel General Wyss Kleist, under my command. Generally speaking, it is not a good thing to put an army group or army under a headquarters of equal status. In the present critical situation, however, this would probably have had its advantages, provided, of course, that no strings were attached. Any possibility of interference by Hitler, or of Army Group A's invoking his decisions in opposition to my own, had to be expressly barred. Hitler, however, was unwilling to accept my conditions, and Army Group A consequently remained autonomous. All that Don Army Group could do was to keep on pressing for a speed-up of Army Group A's evacuation measures, with a view to effecting the earliest possible release of the forces whose intervention south of the Don, and later on the western wing of Don Army Group, would be of decisive importance. Everything depended on cutting down this second phase of the winter campaign to the utmost in order to get the position on the German southern wing finally stabilized. The only hope of doing so lay in smashing the enemy forces which were trying to envelop that wing to the west. In the event, it did prove possible to get the deadlines for the Caucasus evacuation considerably curtailed. The hindrances mentioned above were due partly to what appeared to be the inevitable outcome of static warfare conditions and the difficulties encountered in a mountainous theatre, and partly to the Supreme Command's aversion to surrendering anything voluntarily. The fact that they committed Don Army Group to a battle in the Don area lasting from the end of December to early February was bound, in view of what was happening to Army Group B, to intensify the danger that the whole southern wing would be cut off. It would hardly be possible to find a better illustration of Moltke's definition of strategy than in this battle fought by the two armies of Don Army Group. The reason why we succeeded, despite a series of crises, in mastering the tasks already outlined, is that the Army and Army Group staffs adhered firmly to two well-established German principles of leadership. I. Always conduct operations elastically and resourcefully. E. Give every possible scope to the initiative and self-sufficiency of commanders at all levels. Both principles, admittedly, were greatly at variance with Hitler's own way of thinking. While the first will find expression in the account of the battle fought by our two armies, I should like to say a few words on the second one now. It has always been the particular forte of German leadership to grant wide scope to the self-dependence of subordinate commanders, to allot them tasks which leave the method of execution to the discretion of the individual. From time immemorial, certainly since the elder Moltke's day, this principle has distinguished Germany's military leadership from that of other armies. The latter, far from giving the same latitude to subordinate commanders on the tactical plane, have always tended to prescribe, by means of long and detailed directives, the way orders should actually be carried out, or to make tactical action conform to a specific pattern. On the German side, this system was considered a bad one. It would admittedly appear to reduce the risk of failure in the case of a mediocre commander. Yet it only too easily leads to the executants having to act against the exigencies of the local situation. Worst of all, in its preoccupation with security, it waives the opportunity that may occur through the independent action of a subordinate commander in boldly exploiting some favourable situation at a decisive moment. The German method is really rooted in the German character, which, contrary to all the nonsense talked about blind obedience, has a strong streak of individuality and, possibly as part of its Germanic heritage, finds a certain pleasure in taking risks. The granting of such independence to subordinate commanders does, of course, presuppose that all members of the military hierarchy are imbued with certain tactical or operational axioms. Only the school of the German General Staff can, I suppose, be said to have produced such a consistency of outlook. Nevertheless, there are plenty of occasions when the senior commander in the field is faced with the problem of whether or not to take a hand in the operations of the armies or other formations under his command. The more complex the situation and the smaller the forces with which he has to manage, the more often is he tempted to meddle in the business of his subordinates. As far as my own headquarters was concerned, I think I can say that we only intervened in the operations of our armies when it was quite imperative to do so. This was particularly true whenever the Army Group's operational intentions involved the assumption of responsibilities which it would have been unreasonable to expect the Army headquarters in question to accept. On the other hand, we refrained on principle from proffering off-the-record advice, which kills all initiative and hides responsibility. That Hitler showed little understanding for the old established German principle of leadership, and repeatedly sought to meddle in the operations of subordinate headquarters by issuing specific orders of his own has already been mentioned earlier on. Nothing could be done about such orders when they related to the movements of adjacent army groups, or the action to be taken with formations which were still OKH reserves. However, in the many cases when they directed that a particular line was to be held to the last man and the last round, the force of circumstances usually proved stronger in the end. Something which has also been discussed already and was even harder to overcome was Hitler's dilatoriness in the taking of urgently needed decisions. We could not, after all, compel him to give an order. In such cases one had no choice but to report that in default of an OKH directive by such and such a time or such and such a day, we should act at our own discretion. In contrast to the above, I doubt very much whether any of the armies under our command during this or any later campaign ever had reason to complain that we were slow to take decisions. Whenever they put an inquiry or recommendation up to my headquarters, they always received an immediate reply. Only in difficult situations did the army group ever delay a decision for a very limited period, at most for a few hours or until the following morning. On the whole, apart from Stalingrad, the army group always managed in the end to get the requisite action taken in the face of Hitler's interference or procrastination. 4th Panzer Army had two different tasks to fulfill if it was to keep the rear of Army Group A free. It had to prevent the enemy now on its heels from moving in against the rear of 1st Panzer Army until such time as the latter had wheeled back from the Caucasus onto a front facing east. At the same time, it had to ensure that the enemy did not thrust down the lower reaches of the Don to Rostov and cut off both 4th Panzer Army and Army Group A from their communications zones. It was clear that the army had not enough forces to deny the enemy the whole area between the lower course of the Don and the northern spurs of the Caucasus. Since the loss of the Romanians, all it had up around Kotelnikovo was 57 Panzer Corps, consisting only of two seriously weakened divisions, 17 and 23 Panzer. 15 Luftwaffe Field Division was still not ready to go into action, and 16 Motorized Division had still not been relieved at Yelista by forces from Army Group A. All Don Army Group's efforts to get the army reinforced in good time were unavailing. The provision of 3 Panzer Corps by Army Group A had already been turned down by OKH, and now 7 Panzer Division, which Don Army Group had intended to use with 4th Panzer Army, was retained by Hitler at Rostov to cover this crossing point to the north following the collapse of the Italian army. In essence, this was not a bad idea, except that the infantry division we had requested from Army Group A, i.e. from 17th Army, would have done just as well. But this, as I have said, Hitler had refused to let us have because he feared that its withdrawal from the Novorossiysk sector would cause the Romanian divisions there to give way. An acute threat materialized in the rear of 1st Panzer Army when strong elements of the enemy, which had been following 4th Panzer Army, turned south against 1st Panzer Army just as it was swinging backwards. Although 16 Motorized Division was able to launch a successful attack and bar the way to the enemy from behind the Manich, it was delayed still further from taking part in the struggle of 4th Panzer Army, which it now did not join until the middle of January. A measure which the Army Group had intended taking in its own area to reinforce 4th Panzer Army was thwarted by the enemy. We had envisaged bringing 11 Panzer Division out of the large bend of the Don to join the army. Just when it was about to come over the lower Don, however, the enemy himself crossed the river at two different places to drive from the south and southeast into the rear of the Meath Group, which was still holding the lower Chir on a front facing north. To parry this thrust, and to enable the Meath Group to swing back into a front facing east behind the Kagalnik, 11 Panzer Division had to be committed north of the Don and was lost to 4th Panzer Army in consequence. In the end, therefore, the only forces to augment the two above-named armoured divisions of 57 Panzer Corps were the Viking SS Division, which had already been released earlier by Army Group A, and in mid-January, 16 Motorized Division. By this time, 4th Panzer Army was under pressure through Kotelnikovo from two Soviet armies, 2nd Guards and 51st, which between them comprised 1 tank, 3 mechanized, 3 rifle, and 1 cavalry corps. Shortly afterwards, a third army, 28th, made its appearance further south from the Kalmyk steppes. It could safely be assumed that these three armies were bent not merely on tying down 4th Panzer Army from the front, but ultimately on bypassing it to the north and south in order to encircle it completely. If Hitler thought he could order us, in the face of that preponderance of forces and with such an expanse of territory to cover, to make the army hold some line or other, or else to obtain his approval before undertaking any withdrawal, he was seriously mistaken. As an obstacle, a hard and fast line was likely to prove about as effective as a cobweb in 4th Panzer Army's situation. Nonetheless, he still made repeated attempts to restrict our operational freedom by orders of this kind, and stuck to his refusal to reinforce 4th Panzer Army. By 5th January, therefore, I felt I must ask to be relieved of command of Don Army Group, and sent the Chief of the General Staff a teleprinter message which stated inter alia: should these proposals not be approved, and this headquarters continue to be tied down to the same extent as hitherto, I cannot see that any useful purpose will be served by my continuing as commander of Don Army Group. In the circumstances, it would appear more appropriate to replace me by a sub-directorate of the kind maintained by the Quartermaster General. The Quartermaster General's sub-directorates at army groups were headed by older staff officers who ran their formation's supply and transport services in accordance with direct instructions from the Central Directorate. As things now stood, 4th Panzer Army's object was not to offer inadequate resistance along an overextended line, but to keep its forces close together. Only thus could it offer strong opposition at vital spots or deal the enemy a surprise blow whenever an opportunity presented itself. At times, it would obviously have to denude parts of its area completely and be content to cover others with only a flimsy defence screen. Colonel General Hoth, supported by his admirable Chief of Staff, General Fangor, went about this difficult task with a calm resolution matched only by the versatility of his leadership. He skillfully retarded the progress of the enemy pressing hard on his front without exposing himself to danger by holding any one position too long. Furthermore, by rapidly assembling forces on both his wings, he repeatedly dealt the enemy sharp jabs which foiled every attempt to outflank him. Though unable to let the army have sufficient forces to discharge its difficult task, the Army Group did reserve the right to relieve it of responsibility for at least its most intricate problem by the issue of specific orders. As I have said, 4th Panzer Army actually had to deal with two tasks at once. It had to prevent any of the three enemy armies following it from taking 1st Panzer Army in the rear before the latter had completed its swing back from the Caucasus onto a front facing east, and was ready to look after its own defence. At the same time, it had to counter any attempt by the enemy to drive on Rostov along the lower arm of the Don. If this were successful, the three armies fighting south of the lower Don would be cut off. 4th Panzer Army was only capable of solving one of these tasks at most. Which of them should have priority was a matter that only the Army Group could decide. Admittedly, the threat to Rostov was the greater danger in the long run. Yet should the enemy succeed in encircling 1st Panzer Army as it wheeled back into its new position, there could be no further point even in holding Rostov, and the three German armies south of the Don would be doomed. If, on the other hand, the withdrawal of 1st Panzer Army were successfully accomplished, ways and means would be found to avert a crisis at Rostov. The enemy did try to exploit the two opportunities indicated above. It has already been mentioned that 16 Motorized Division had just been in time to intercept the Soviet elements which had turned off to take 1st Panzer Army in the rear. Yet, with the same operational aim in view, the enemy made repeated attempts to envelop 4th Panzer Army to the south, and thereby to introduce himself between the latter and 1st Panzer Army. At the same time, he endeavoured to drive along the lower Don through Konstantinovka in the direction of Rostov. On 7th of January, a smallish enemy force turned up on the northern bank of the Don some 12 miles from the Army Group headquarters location at Novocherkassk, after the Cossacks and frontier troops guarding that stretch of river had given way. He had to dislodge this domestic invader with a few tanks fetched out of workshops for the purpose. Subsequently, the tank corps of which this enemy force formed part was turned off towards Proletarskaya in the rear of 4th Panzer Army, which meant that we were rid of the threat to Rostov for at least the next few days. 4th Panzer Army, for its own part, was duly able to cope with this threat on its northern flank. By 14th of January, 1st Panzer Army had completed its withdrawal movement, having been able to speed it up after all in the meantime. It now had its left wing established on a line running from Cherkassk to Petrovskoye. This meant that at least a measure of operational cooperation was now possible between 1st and 4th Panzer armies, even if a wide gap still yawned between Petrovskoye and Proletarskaya. This admittedly was partly covered by the mudflats of the Manich. The first part of 4th Panzer Army's task, which had been to keep the rear of Army Group A free in the area south of the Don, was thus fulfilled. There still remained the second part, that of holding open this Army Group's lines of communication through Rostov. In the face of the enemy's many times greater strength, the accomplishment of the second part was complicated by the fact that 1st Panzer Army was initially to remain several days in the line it had reached in order to prepare the further evacuation of its rear areas. Indeed, 4th Panzer Army's task was to come dangerously near to not being fulfilled at all, for even now Hitler could still not make up his mind to abandon the Caucasus entirely. The question of whether 1st Panzer Army was to be pulled back onto the northern bank of the Don, or whether the whole of Army Group A should remain in the Kuban, still hung in the balance. While 4th Panzer Army was carrying out its task south of the Don during the first half of January, Army Detachment Hollet had a no less difficult job to do in the large bend of the river. As was stated in the chapter on Stalingrad, the enemy had spent the past few weeks making repeated attacks in infinitely superior strength on the Army Detachment's front along the Chir. At General Hollet's disposal, on a front extending some 125 miles from the Don at Nizhny-Chirskaya as far as Kamensk-Shakhtinsky, were, and this included the Meath Group, now under command, 4 infantry divisions, 62, 294, 336 and 387, which had already been very badly worn down in the fighting to date. Also helping to hold the front were some alarm units, and, a valuable buttress, these, anti-aircraft units commanded by the seasoned General Stahel. As for the Army Detachment's 2 Luftwaffe field divisions, what little was left of them inevitably had to be incorporated into army formations. The main strength of the Army Detachment was constituted by 6 and 11 Panzer divisions, augmented by the newly arrived 7 Panzer. The badly battered 22 Panzer Division had to be disbanded. With these forces, General Hollet had to prevent the enemy in the north from moving down on the lower reaches of the Don, i.e. into the rear of 4th Panzer Army, and, most important of all, from breaking through to Rostov for as long as 4th Panzer Army and Army Group A were in the area south of the Don. Furthermore, it was the Army Detachment's job to see that the enemy opposite its left wing did not push through to the Donets crossings between Forchstadt and Voroshilovgrad, thereby opening the way to Rostov from the northwest. At the same time, however, the Army Detachment found itself threatened on both flanks, in the west as a result of the disappearance from the battlefield of the Italians, in whose place the Fretta-Pico group was slowly fighting its way back from the Milerovo region towards the Donets, and in the east because several enemy army corps now had crossed the Don, first at Potemkinskaya and then at Tsimlianskaya. They could only be stopped, as was noted earlier, by throwing in N Panzer Division and bending the Meath Group back onto a front facing east from behind the Kagalnik. Like 4th Panzer Army, Army Detachment Hollet reflected firm yet versatile leadership in mastering its task amid heavy fighting and incessant crises. Here too, however, the Army Group assumed ultimate responsibility by ordering it, at great, if not immediate, risk to the spots thus laid bare, to bunch its armour together for short offensive thrusts. The fact that the Army Detachment succeeded in finally halting the enemy on the Donets and thereby in saving 4th Panzer Army and Army Group A from being cut off south of the Don, must be ascribed first and foremost, while not forgetting the way its staff handled operations, to the bravery with which the infantry divisions and all other formations and units helping to hold the line stood their ground against the enemy's recurrent attacks. Yet their defence could never have been maintained had not our armoured divisions time and again shown up at danger spots at just the right moment. On one hand, they intervened to ward off the impending encirclement of the army detachment's right wing as it wheeled back onto the Kogalnik, and later to intercept a threatened breakthrough in that sector. On the other, they surprised the enemy by driving straight into his assembly positions as he was about to attack the army detachment's northern front forward of the Donets. While it was the business of the army detachment itself to mount such close counterblows as part of its defensive role, the actual responsibility for risking them usually lay with the army group. The latter had to relieve the army detachment of responsibility for any emergencies which might arise whenever, on army group instructions, it concentrated its armour in one spot and thereby imperilled the remaining sectors of the front. By the middle of January 1943, the operational situation on the southern wing of the Eastern Front had come to a head. Its seeds had been laid in the late autumn of 1942, when our military command had allowed the front to solidify into a line which was operationally untenable from a long-term point of view. What had clearly been shaping up since Christmas week 1942, when the last opportunity for 6th Army to break out was missed, had now come to pass. Only the desperate struggle waged by the German fighting troops and command staffs had so far staved off an even worse crisis. 6th Army was doomed. The best it could do now, with what little strength it still possessed, was to render its comrades in the Don Bend and the Caucasus the last supreme service of tying down strong enemy forces for just a short while longer. It was clear that after the loss of 6th Army, the Caucasus region could not even be held on a reduced scale. Now, however, thanks to the doggedness and dexterity with which 4th Panzer Army had been fighting in the area south of the Don, there was at least a chance that when the Caucasus went, Army Group A need not be lost with it. Its eastern wing, which had been in the greatest danger of all, was now safely retracted, and even though 1st Panzer Army was still 190 miles from the river crossing at Rostov, it was nonetheless out of the mountains and no longer threatened from the rear. If things came to the worst, it could fight its own way back from now on. In the area between the Don and Donets, it had so far been possible to deny the enemy access to Rostov and prevent him from closing the trap from the north behind the 3 armies standing south of the lower arm of the Don. But it was evident that neither Army Detachment Hollet nor the Freta Pico Group, now fighting around Milerovo and consisting of HQ 30 Corps with 3 mountain and 304 infantry divisions under command, could prevent the enemy from crossing the Donets upstream from Kamensk-Shakhtinsky once he was strong enough to reach so far round to the west. From then on, he would be at liberty to drive on Rostov from the northwest or straight down to the Sea of Azov. Worst of all, about this time the Army Group B sector held by the Hungarian army on the Middle Don collapsed before a fresh enemy offensive. The connecting front in the north was also caught up in the disaster. Army Group B wanted to take its forces back behind the Adar as far up as Starobielsk, which meant leaving open the Donets downstream from Voroshilovgrad. For all practical purposes, however, this wing of the Army Group was to cease to exist within a few days. A wide gap opened up from Voroshilovgrad to the north, in which only isolated German battle groups of Army Group B were offering desperate local resistance. The Hungarians, like the Italians, had disappeared from the battlefield. It seemed certain that OKH could not hope to plug this hole with the reserves now on the way. In any case, as far as Don Army Group was concerned, the time had obviously come to leapfrog strong forces from the area south of the Don to the Middle Donets if the enemy were to be prevented from tying off Don Army Group and Army Group A. The German Supreme Command still did not agree, however. Either it was unable to foresee what turn events would inevitably take if nothing effective were done to make us strong in the crucial area between the Donets and Lower Dnieper, or it simply would not see the dangers of the situation. Hitler was still not disposed to give up the Caucasus region. He still thought he could somehow maintain a front south of the Don, which would at least safeguard his possession of the Maikop oil fields. His minimum requirement was the retention of an extensive bridgehead in the Kuban, from which he proposed at a later date to renew his grab for the Caucasus oil. And so, in the weeks that followed, our army group was compelled to continue its desperate struggle on both sides of the Don in the interest of a systematic withdrawal of Army Group A. All this time it was having a fierce dispute with the Supreme Command over the idea of leapfrogging forces to the Donetsk area. This concerned not only the acceptability of the principle as such, but also the question as to how many of Army Group A's forces should be brought back through Rostov to the decisive battleground. To tie up substantial elements of Army Group A in a Kuban bridgehead amounted, in our opinion, to sheer wishful thinking from the point of view of operations as a whole. By 14th January, the day on which 1st Panzer Army reached the line Cherkask-Petrovskoye and established a front facing eastwards, another crisis was brewing in the area of Army Detachment Holit. On that day, an enemy tank corps succeeded in breaking through towards the Donets on the right wing of Army Group B, in the area of the Freta-Pico Group, south of Milerovo. Although OKH provided the group with a new infantry division, 302, this alone could not possibly suffice to stabilize the situation on the river. When, on 16th of January, OKH placed the Freta-Pico Group under command of Don Army Group, while simultaneously extending the latter's front to the Aidar, it was still not even certain whether the group would get back behind the Donets at all. It had meanwhile emerged that the enemy intended to throw 3 or 4 mechanized corps against the Donets on either side of Kamensk-Shakhtinsky in the Freta-Pico Group's own area. Fortunately, thanks to a neat success scored a few days previously by Army Detachment Holit, when 2 of its armoured divisions had struck a surprise blow on the Kalitva, an enemy attack had been wiped out there while still in the preparation stage. We therefore ordered the army detachment to execute its planned withdrawal into the Donetsk positions in such a way as to have an armoured division available at the earliest possible moment for mobile defence of the Donetsk sector of Fortstadt-Kamensk. For operations in the newly acquired Kamensk-Voroshilovgrad sector of the river, however, there was nothing to hand, except for the Italians who had streamed back there as stragglers. In other words, there was a danger that Don Army Group's Donetsk front would shortly be outflanked to the west. At the same time, it became evident that the enemy intended to envelop Army Detachment Holit from the east as well. In the gap between its right wing, where the Donets joined the Don, and 4th Panzer Army, which was still having to cover 1st Panzer Army's northern flank against a far superior enemy forward of Salsk on the Manish, 2 enemy corps were identified in the angle between the Sal, Don and Manish. These could be expected to attempt to cross the Don for an advance on Rostov, or else to thrust into the rear of Army Detachment Holit's Donetsk positions. Don Army Group accordingly proposed that it now be allowed to shift 4th Panzer Army over to its western wing, while leaving 1 division temporarily forward of Rostov to keep the crossing open for 1st Panzer Army. This would naturally have necessitated OKH's issuing simultaneous orders for the withdrawal of Army Group A, with 1st Panzer Army moving back on Rostov and 17th Army into the Kuban. Once again, it was impossible to get a quick decision from Hitler. Neither would he countenance the Army Group's proposal that Army Group A's armoured divisions be concentrated in the area of 4th Panzer Army for a short offensive stroke to facilitate 1st Panzer Army's withdrawal and thereby to speed up the release of 4th Panzer Army. Not until 18th of January did OKH finally concede 4th Panzer Army freedom of movement, to the extent that the latter no longer had to cover the northern flank of 1st Panzer Army on the Manik northeastwards of Salsk. On the other hand, Don Army Group still had to safeguard Army Group A's use of the Rostov-Tikhorets railway line until 88 supply trains had passed safely through to stock up the Kuban bridgehead. Whether 1st Panzer Army would now be withdrawn towards Rostov or into the Kuban was still anybody's guess. the time being taken to decide whether to allow forces to be leapfrogged westwards inside the German southern wing could only benefit the enemy, of course. It enabled him to exploit the collapse of the Italian and Hungarian sectors of Army Group B's front and to assemble powerful forces with which to advance over the Middle Donets towards the coast of the Sea of Azov or the Dnieper crossings, forces to which, for the moment, we had nothing to offer in the way of opposition. The enemy was also given opportunity to concentrate his formations for a direct assault on Rostov and to envelop Army Detachment Hollitz's western wing through Voroshilovgrad. On 20th January, the enemy in the area of 4th Panzer Army launched an attack over the Lower Manich towards Rostov with 4 corps he had concentrated for this purpose. His tanks reached the Rostov airfield, though 16 Panzer Division, which 4th Panzer Army had thrown over to this northern wing, had been delaying the enemy's progress between the Don and Manich by repeated thrusts into his flank from the southern bank of the latter. It had naturally been unable to halt all 4 corps on its own. By simultaneously attacking the Army's 57 Panzer Corps, which was now gradually falling back on Rostov from the Middle Manich, the enemy endeavoured to detain 4th Panzer Army's main forces forward of Rostov until he had possession of the Rostov crossing in their rear. Furthermore, the enemy was hitting hard at the front of Army Detachment Hollit. Here, too, he obviously aimed to pin down our forces until he had encircled them by the capture of Rostov and an envelopment movement across the Middle Donets. By launching these attacks against General Meath's corps in the angle between the Don and Donets, as well as on either side of Kamensk, he was presumably also trying to prevent the release of any forces from this front which could be thrown against him on the Middle Donets. Once again, the Army Group's problem was which threat to tackle first. 2 armoured divisions, 7 and 11 Panzer, were standing by in Army Detachment Hollitz's area to be switched to the western wing on the Middle Donets. But however great the danger there might become in the long run, the Army Group felt it was even more urgent at this moment to avert the threat to Rostov. Everything possible had to be done to get not only 4th, but at least the whole of 1st Panzer Army back through the city. Otherwise, there would not be the slightest prospect of ever assembling sufficient forces on the Army Group's western wing to counteract the danger of the entire southern wings being surrounded on the seacoasts. For this reason, Don Army Group resolved that, in order to prevent the capture of Rostov, the 2 above-named armoured divisions should in the first instance be used to deliver a sharp blow at the enemy attacking over the Lower Manich in the direction of the city. However, because of petrol shortage, all the supply trains at that time were going to the Kuban bridgehead by way of Rostov, and the impossibility of obtaining air support for our attack under the prevailing weather conditions, this counterblow took longer to effect than was admissible in the existing situation. For time was pressing more and more. Since 6th Army's resistance was now coming to an end, we had to expect to have most of the enemy's Stalingrad forces about our ears within 2 or 3 weeks. I had already told General Zeitzler on 22nd January that I should not be surprised to see them turn up in the Starobielsk area, i.e. in the broad gap between Don Army Group and Army Group B. The same day, Hitler finally decided that a part, at least, of 1st Panzer Army should not be taken into the Kuban bridgehead, but be brought back through Rostov, that is, into what was later to be the decisive battleground. This, though only a compromise solution in our own eyes, was nonetheless welcome in the sense of the Army Group's own conception of operations. It was, however, of the utmost importance that this withdrawal should be performed at maximum speed, so that 4th Panzer Army, in its turn, could be transferred to the Army Group's western wing at the earliest possible moment. The rapidity of 1st Panzer Army's withdrawal through Rostov depended entirely on the ability of Army Group A's other components to adapt their speed of movement accordingly. Yet it was clear that even now the Army Group was still unable to increase its speed to the extent the situation demanded. I have never been able to elicit a satisfactory reason for this. At all events, 1st Panzer Army maintained after coming under my command that had it not been repeatedly halted on instructions from above, it could in fact have moved much more smartly from the very start. Both Army Group A and OKH disputed this. Whatever the answer, the fact remains that Army Group A had so timed the move of its left wing, which was still around Belaya Glina, 30 miles east of Tikorets on 23rd of January, that it would not reach Tikorets until 1st February. On 23rd January, Don Army Group came into another legacy, this time the southern part of Army Group B's front between the Donets and Starobielsk. As usual, the liabilities far outweighed everything else. They consisted of about 40 extra miles of front and at least 3 enemy corps now on the advance in that sector, one of them armoured and the other mechanized. The only asset we acquired, now that the Italians could no longer be counted upon, was 19 Panzer Division, at that moment located around Starobielsk. The very next day, however, it was forced to yield Starobielsk to the enemy. It was an exceptional achievement on the part of this valiant division, so outstandingly led by Lieutenant General Postel, that it was ever able to fight a way through to the west at all. The enemy's action in swinging south across the Donets was something it could not prevent. On 24th of January, Hitler decided that if possible the whole of 1st Panzer Army should be withdrawn through Rostov from now on. Since its southern wing was still at Armavir, this naturally meant tying down 4th Panzer Army south of the Don even longer in order to keep Rostov open. Whether the army could still be thrown over to the western wing of the army group in time thus became increasingly doubtful. There were nonetheless 2 gratifying facts to record. Army Group A, which had been understandably reluctant to see one of its armies disappear across the Don, had realized after all that its own fate, too, would be decided on the Donets, and not in the Kuban. Besides, it was becoming more and more unlikely that a force of any strength in the Kuban could be supplied across the Straits of Kerch. Henceforth, Army Group A, as well, came out in favour of withdrawing the largest possible number of forces through Rostov. The second fact was that on 25th of January, the above-mentioned attack of 2 of our armoured divisions on the enemy advancing across the lower Manich finally produced the success we had hoped for. With that, the immediate threat to the Rostov crossings was eliminated for the time being. Instead, the situation on 4th Panzer Army's southern wing took another critical turn. Bringing up fresh forces, which appeared to have been drawn from the Soviet armies pressing after Army Group A, the enemy attempted to get between 4th Panzer Army and the northern wing of 1st Panzer Army in order to envelop the former from the south and force the latter away from Rostov. Don Army Group accordingly presented Army Group A with a final demand that it should join in this battle with an armoured division and also step up 1st Panzer Army's withdrawal on Rostov with every means at its disposal. At last, on 27th of January, at least the northern half of 1st Panzer Army came under the command of Don Army Group, with the result that the latter was now itself able to order the measures to which I have just referred. At the same time, since 4th Panzer Army still had to keep the Rostov crossing open for the time being, Don Army Group decided that HQ, 1st Panzer Army, which could be released sooner south of the Don, should be the first to move over to the Middle Donets. It was to be followed there by its divisions as they were fed through Rostov, as well as by forces of 4th Panzer Army as they became available. By 31st January, things had reached a point where 1st Panzer Army could be expected to come back through Rostov, though whether it would arrive at the Donets in time to stop the enemy breaking across the river to the seacoast was quite another matter. The unfortunate thing was that even now not all of the army's formations could be got to the decisive battleground. Thanks to Hitler's hesitation in deciding whether to bring the army back towards Rostov or to move it into the Kuban, 50 Division, one of the well-tried formations of the former Crimean Army, had not been in time to join in the move to Rostov and had gone over to 17th Army. Furthermore, after days of indecision, Hitler at the last moment reallocated 13 Panzer Division to Army Group A for use in the Kuban after we had striven to the last to preserve a gap through which to slip it to Rostov. Thus, both these divisions were withheld from the crucial battleground, while some 400,000 men lay virtually paralysed in the Kuban. Admittedly, the latter served to tie down the powerful enemy forces who were vainly striving to do away with the bridgehead. but they never achieved the operational effect which Hitler sought, and ultimately the enemy was left free to decide what size of force he should leave there. Not even Hitler's argument that a large force must be kept in the Kuban in order to deny the enemy the naval port of Novorossiysk held any water. He still had to give it up in the end. On 29th of January, our headquarters moved from Taganrog, where it had gone on the 12th, to Stalino, as the army group's main point of effort now had to shift from the Don to the Donets. During the battles in and south of the large bend of the Don, the aim of which had been to cover the withdrawal of Army Group A from the Caucasus, but in which the larger issue was whether the German southern wing could be preserved at all, a fresh problem was already emerging. The question was whether this southern wing would be able to maintain the Donets area. This area, which lies between the Sea of Azov, the Don estuary, and the lower and middle Donets, and is roughly bounded in the west by the line Mariupol-Krasnoarmyskoye Isium, had played a fundamental part in Hitler's operational calculations as far back as 1941, for he considered possession of it to be of vital importance to the outcome of the war. On the one hand, he contended that we should not get through the war economically without its vast coal deposits, while on the other, he considered that the loss of these had dealt a telling blow to the Soviet war effort. Donets coal, he declared, was the only kind the Russians had, at least in European Russia, that was suitable for coking, and sooner or later the lack of it must paralyze their tank and munitions production. While I do not propose to discuss the pros and cons of these assertions, the fact remains that the Russians managed to produce thousands of tanks and millions of shells in the years 1942-3 without recourse to this Donets coal. The real question was whether we could remain the military masters of the Donets basin or not. From the point of view of our war economy, it was unquestionably desirable that we should retain it, with the one qualification that while we extracted substantial quantities of Donets coal for our own use, all the bunker coal for the railway supplying this vast territory had to be brought out from Germany because Donets coal did not suit our locomotives. As the Reichsbahn had to run several coal trains a day to cover its own requirements, the proportion of troop trains fell off accordingly. Be that as it may, Hitler maintained that the German war economy could not possibly do without the Donets basin. A year later, he said exactly the same thing about the manganese output of Nikopol. And yet our possession of the area was in doubt from the moment the Hungarian front collapsed south of Voronezh, throwing open the enemy's road to the Donets and across it to the Dnieper crossings, or the Sea of Azov. The first time the question of our fighting to hold the Donets basin came up was in a telephone conversation I had with General Zeitzler on 19th of January. He wanted to hear my views on the subject, having broached it to Hitler, albeit without success, the day before. This was the day on which the danger appeared of a breach in the whole front from Voroshilovgrad to Voronezh. I told Zeitzler that however important this area might be, even from the economic point of view, the question was relatively simple to answer. If it were to be retained in its entirety, strong forces must be assembled with a minimum delay and as far east as was feasible, forward of Kharkov, if possible. Should we be unable to do this because it was thought that Central and Northern Army groups could not spare any more forces, because the new drafts at home were not ready, because OKW would not release any forces from other fronts, or finally because such a sudden deployment would be too much for the railways in their present state, we should simply have to accept the consequences. The southern wing of the German armies could not close the gap with its own forces if it remained on the lower Don. Nor could it go on fighting there in isolation if the expected reinforcements took a long time to arrive and deployed far to the rear, i.e. out of all relation to the operations of the southern wing. The battle being fought by the southern wing and the deployment of the new forces must be so attuned to one another in a spatial sense as to become operationally coherent. Either the new forces must be made to deploy swiftly and relatively far to the east, in which case it would be possible for the army group to remain on the lower Don and Donets, or else they could not, and the army group would have to be pulled back to join them. If one of these two courses were not taken, the enemy would have an opportunity to cut off the whole southern wing before any reinforcements could make their presence felt. General Zeitzler agreed with me. It was certain in any case that the SS Panzer Corps due to assemble around Kharkov by the middle of February would not have the necessary strength to close the gap now being torn open from Voroshilovgrad to Voronezh. Nor could it be made operational in time to launch an offensive thrust north of the Donets for the purpose of freeing the flank of the southern wing in the event of its remaining on the lower Don and Donets. The next few days served to increase the Army Group's alarm at the trend of events in its deep flank. As early as 20th January, we had noticed 2 enemy corps trying to outflank the Army Group's left wing, the Freta-Pico Group at Kamensk, by a movement in the direction of Voroshilovgrad. At the same time, the enemy was feeling his way forward against the Italian remnants behind the Donets east of Voroshilovgrad. Otherwise, his main forces apparently aimed to drive west on Starobielsk in the first instance, obviously with the object of gaining some initial elbow room. As soon as the enemy had attained these aims, however, it could be assumed that he would not only strive to envelop the Freta-Pico group, but also, by throwing strong forces further round to the west, to advance over the Donets towards the Dnieper crossings or the coast of the Sea of Azov. Only 4 days later, on 24th of January, there were already reports of enemy cavalry south of the Donets in the region of Voroshilovgrad, though it was always possible that a false alarm had been sounded by some jumpy town major in a rear area. On 31st January, I sent OKH a teleprinter message restating my views on the problem of holding the Donets Basin. The prior condition for retaining it, I said, was that a timely attempt be made from the direction of Kharkov to relieve the pressure on us, and that the enemy in the area northeast of the city be beaten before the muddy season set in. If, as unfortunately seemed to be the case, neither of these should prove practicable, there would be no possibility of holding the basin, at least not to its full extent in the east. Any attempt to remain on the lower Don and Donets would thus be a mistake from the operational point of view. A second factor which must not be overlooked, I went on, was that our present forces would not alone suffice to hold the whole Donets area if, as seemed certain, the enemy were to bring up further reinforcements from the Caucasus and Stalingrad. It was just not good enough to pin one's hopes on the enemy's becoming exhausted, great though his losses might well have been in attacks on German troops, or on his operations being brought to a premature halt by difficulties of supply. These were the arguments which Hitler constantly produced to General Zeitzler whenever the latter drew his attention, on the strength of the basically accurate intelligence reports he received from us, to the tremendous numerical superiority of the enemy. Undoubtedly there was some justification for what Hitler said, yet it had to be borne in mind that the enemy's attacks on Allied armies had cost him very little, and that he was far less dependent on supply and transport than we Germans were in enemy territory. The very next few days confirmed the Army Group's appreciation of the enemy's intentions. It became clear that he was out to crush our front on the Donets, and simultaneously to outflank us to the west. On 2nd February, he crossed the Donets east of Voroshilovgrad, without encountering any serious opposition from the Italians there. The assault group he had assembled consisted of 3 tank corps, 1 mechanized and 1 rifle corps, obviously part of the forces which had previously overrun the Italians on the Don. The objectives of this grouping could be taken to be Rostov or Taganrog. After ejecting 19 Panzer Division from Starobielsk, the enemy had swung another strong force of 3 or 4 tank corps and a rifle corps southwest against the line Slaviansk, Lysychansk. It was plain that he planned a movement to outflank our wing further west. This, if one ignored the residue of Italians, he could expect to find around or even east of Voroshilovgrad. Except for the measures the Army Group was able to take in its own sphere of command, with the ultimate object of flinging 1st Panzer Army over to the Middle Donets. Therefore, the period following the end of January was taken up with wrangles between the Army Group and OKH on how to proceed with the operations as a whole. As has been stated, I had already emphasized to General Zeitzler on 19th of January that the whole of the Donets Basin could only be held on condition that strong forces intervened swiftly and effectively from the Kharkov direction. As no prospect of this existed, I asked for permission to reduce the echeloning of our eastern wing at least far enough to release the forces which the army group would need if it were to prevent the amputation of the southern wing with its own resources and the reinforcements it had been promised. We had already dispatched 1st Panzer Army to the Middle Donets to counteract the threat of envelopment that had now become acute there. What had to be done now was to get 4th Panzer Army too, out of the balcony on the lower Don and Donets. This was the only timely way to meet the danger of an enemy attempt to cut us off from the Dnieper crossings by advancing across the Isium-Slaviansk line. Further up the Don, moreover, the enemy must always be expected to bring even more troops over the river towards the lower Dnieper than had already been reported at Slaviansk. Apart from 1st Division of the SS Panzer Corps, which had meanwhile arrived at Kharkov, there were nothing but battered remnants to oppose him anywhere in the area of Army Group B. These alone could not prevent him from wheeling into our deep flank. But 4th Panzer Army could only be released if a considerable reduction were made in the length of the Army Group front. Instead of continuing to hold the extensive arc formed by the lower Don and the Donets from Rostov as far as the region west of Voroshilovgrad, the right wing of the Army Group must be taken back, as it were, onto the string of the bow. This string was the system of defences which the German southern wing had held in 1941 after the first withdrawal from Rostov. A line running behind the Mius and continuing northwards as far as the Middle Donets. Taking the front back into this position naturally meant abandoning the eastern part of the Donets coalfields. In order to justify this withdrawal, I made an attempt to bring home my conception of the long-term conduct of military operations to the Supreme Command. The following is roughly how I expressed it in a teleprinter message addressed for Hitler's personal attention. To hold the Don Donets salient for any length of time was not possible, even in a purely defensive context, with the forces at the Army Group's disposal. In the event of the Supreme Command's having to remain on the defensive in 1943 on account of the loss of 6th Army and its 20 divisions, an all-out attempt to defend the entire Donets Basin would mean committing all the forces there that could possibly be made available. That, however, would give the enemy a free hand to take the offensive with far superior forces at any point he cared to pick on the remainder of the front.